Roger, our revenue may slow. We're spending tons of money. We're up 40% of the year, and the stock is still up. How does this happen?
Well, listen, I think he just saw a great example of it. Julia's interview with Sheryl was fantastic in many ways, but Sheryl is such an extraordinary communicator. What I want to remind our viewers, though, is that the real issue that we're dealing with here is the business model, not just of Facebook, but also of Google and now increasingly Amazon and Microsoft in this area. The reason that there are privacy issues, the reason why there's danger for democracy, the reason why there are issues of public health and competition and innovation is because there is this massive gathering of private data and the use of it in ways that consumers are just completely unaware. And that's the model that we have to fix. And I really applaud Sheryl and especially Mark Zuckerberg for engaging in the political conversation, but I want to keep pushing them hard to stop doing these superficial things that they're doing, which, yes, do have some cost to growth and profitability, but which don't actually address the underlying problems, and get focused on changing the business model in ways that are going to make the progress that we need to see.
Mark, my take is that Facebook has contained the risk that we saw, and that 42% move in the stock speaks to that. It's in Sheryl Sandberg's interest to say, look at all the pain we're taking, but I don't know. I don't know how much pain it really is.
I think you got to look at the results and not so much listen to what Sheryl's saying. The management team at Facebook has done a tremendous job at talking down expectations, not trying to get things too far ahead of them. But look at the financial results. Last quarter, ad revenue growth over 30% on an FX neutral basis, and we started to see expense growth slow pretty dramatically, which had been the issue for the past year and a half. Both CapEx and OpEx. So the financial results are phenomenal. I think a lot of this is just trying to hold back expectations a bit. But I like to hear Roger, is talking about this management team now starting to work with others, take proactive steps. I feel a little bit of glimmer of optimism from Roger on Facebook that I hadn't heard in the past. So that makes me also feel a little bit better too.
Is that fair, Roger?
Well, I think, Mark, if you actually watch what I do, I've always been encouraging the team to do the right thing. And I believe that engaging in the conversation is super important. And it really stands in stark contrast to Google, which is still trying to pretend that they're not involved in any of this, which is laughable. I mean, Google does surveillance to a degree that, very few people are aware of how deeply involved in our lives Google is and the kind of data that they get. Again, one of the other points Sheryl made was relative to China, and I think that one is completely a piece of misdirection. Because, again, competing with China means competing in behavioral manipulation, and I just don't think that's a good thing for American companies to be doing. I think it's candidly that we should be out of it. What I really want us to do, both for our government and for the people who work here, is remember that internet platforms are today where the chemical industry was in 1950, when they were pouring, byproducts like mercury and chromium into fresh water. We have the digital equivalent of toxic oil spills, where there are these external costs these companies are creating that they're not bearing the cost of, and that when we get around to it and force them to pay those costs, they're going to be a lot less profitable than they are now. But that won't make them unattractive businesses. It'll just make them more responsible and appropriate players in our economy. And that's what I hope Mark and Sheryl will drive the company to.
Roger, to extend that analog, I mean, eventually those companies that ended up putting toxins in the Hudson River and whatever had to go back, clean it up, pay for the cleanup. I mean, right. I assume you're arguing that day of reckoning will come. Is it just now longer? It's farther away than we thought?
No, actually, I would argue, John, that it's actually coming much closer. I think what Facebook is doing is being really smart, which is they're trying to engage, as Mark said, in framing the conversation so that they have some influence on what the final outcome will be. Remember, the alternative of this, if Google's way of doing this, which is to say nothing to see here, persists, you wind up with the Sri Lanka model, where when something goes wrong, you have to shut down the platforms. That's the only choice available to governments right now. And I think what Facebook is doing is trying to sit there and say, wait a minute, we'll give you this, we'll give you that, let's try to find common ground. And I don't think Facebook's gone nearly far enough, but I think at least they're in the conversation, and from here we can have a negotiation.
To that point, if you missed Sandberg a few moments ago on our air, it's all over the tape, but here's what she told our Julia Borston.
While people are concerned with the size and power of tech companies, there's also a concern in the United States about the size and power of Chinese tech companies. And the, realization that those companies are not going to be broken up. And so the question is for us is, how do we make sure we protect privacy? How do we make sure we work with authorities to safeguard elections? How do we make sure that the right content is on Facebook? And how do we make sure that the right regulatory framework is in place? And we're working hard on all of that.
Is that a way investors should be looking at this
idea of U.S. versus China big tech, or is that essentially a diversion?
I think the analogy she used there is probably the wrong one. No, I don't think investors should be looking at it that way. But I do think it does serve Facebook well to kind of pit the two countries against one another. But they're obviously looking for regulators to work with Facebook to back their position and think of it in that context. It's certainly the topic or the way people are, the lens that regulators are looking at it today, and it probably is the right text or context for them to use when talking to DC, but not to Wall Street. I don't think.
Yeah, Roger, is there any way that you can see that separating, say, Facebook and WhatsApp puts the United States at a disadvantage versus China and Chinese companies?
Well, listen, I think if your goal is to compete in behavioral manipulation, then breaking them up is a problem. But in my mind, behavioral manipulation is fundamentally un-American. I think America is all about freedom of choice. It's all about liberty. And Google in particular, which is the biggest player in behavioral manipulation, is, they're really competing against China. And I just don't think that's appropriate. I'd like to see AI and all these technologies applied to, empowering citizens as opposed to manipulating them. And so I just think the whole conversation's wrong, just as I think this whole conversation of Facebook's way of addressing election security with AI and moderators after the fact. I mean, that's just never going to work. You have to get rid of the hate speech and the disinformation before it gets into the system. You can't have the algorithms amplifying that stuff disproportionately.